Okay, well, welcome everyone to what is going to be initially a members only stream. I'll make this public maybe Monday or thereabouts. But we will be responding to a video from the Mormon News Roundup, and that's going to be fun. So I actually have my friend and returning guest, Zachary Wright, more often than Ron, on. So I beat you to the punch before you tell that joke. So welcome back, Zachary. It's been a while. I think the last time you were on, you were responding to Bill Reel and some of these
Actually, the
topics.
last one we did was when you and I did our tag team against the James White video, when he responded to you and the Gospel for Mormons.
Oh yeah, well, I was still back in Utah, so yeah, that's fun. By the way, interesting announcement about James White in the next few days. Be on the outlook for that. But be that on as it may, you actually recently won an award in August. So I want to tell some people about that.
Sure. So Fair was kind enough to allow me to speak at their conference, and they also presented me with the John Taylor Defender of the Faith Award. I should have brought it with me. I left it back at the where I was staying. But it was very kind of them. I'm deeply honored. I sometimes I worry that they forget that I'm like 24 or something. Like I don't if I'm going to be so real with you, Robert, between you, me, and the wall, if they were giving the award based on like quality of presentations or presentations I liked, I would have given the award to Josh Coates because I really liked his presentation, and I think he did a great job at the Fair conference. But at the end of the day, I'm grateful for Fair, and I'm excited. I'm not here on their behalf, but I'm certainly grateful for all of the kind words and the wonderful opportunities that I've been provided, including getting the chance to know awesome, really cool scholars like you. So that's great.
Oh, that's good. So you actually sent me a short video from this fellow, who's kind of a bit more infamous even in like Exmo circles because of some
Yes.
shenanigans he's been up to recently involving someone who hates my guts. But that's a different matter. A
We
certain
won't go
skin.
too much into that. Admittedly, as
Yeah.
I was trying to peel back the layers for that, it really kind of boiled down to it was just infighting, and the unfortunate reality is that I I don't necessarily fully understand that story. Like I don't. So I'm not gonna deal with that. I'm more of a person that likes dealing with arguments instead of people's side stuff anyway. And so if we'll be dealing primarily with that. Even so, I found some very significant problems with a video that was presented by Mormon News Roundup. There's quite a bit of there are quite a bit of issues in terms of fallacious reasoning, in terms of the strength of a lot of the parallels that he tries to argue for the Book of Mormon. But we'll go ahead and talk about that now. I'll go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint here.
Yeah.
So
I'll let you present and I'll chime in here and there, but I'll go into the background.
yes, so I appreciate that. Thank you. So this is what we're talking about, debunking Mormon News Roundup. We're specifically talking about a video that he made. Oh, all right, here we go. So who is this guy? So he goes by D-Vase. It took me a second to figure out what what's, how are you supposed to pronounce that? Because it's spelled like dives, but it's D-Vase. Lazarus, that's his Facebook handle. That's something like that. His actual name is Burke Sorensen, and I only mention that because it took a second for me to figure out where he got his education from. So I'll just go ahead and play some of this PowerPoint stuff up here. Let's see, move that here so I can read it. So he was born into the church. Kind of had like a rough family growing up. I think his parents split. He made a video about it, and so I'm not like saying anything that isn't public record or anything here. But he served a mission to Washington, D.C., and he got a master's degree and PhD. And specifically, his work is in music. So I want to say that he taught music at a variety of different universities. So I want to say he taught down in Arizona for a little bit. He also was an adjunct at BYU for a bit. He had some associations with the Tabernacle at Temple Square, the orchestra at Temple Square, I think. He had some connections there. But one of the big things for him was that he realized that he wasn't sure how he was able to discern whether God was communicating with him. And so he was physically and mentally out for a number of years in the church. The pivotal moment was when he read the CES letter and the late war in 2022, and he became convinced the Book of Mormon wasn't true. As you kind of alluded to, Robert, he's not on good terms with some big name critics out there. He had a massive falling out with Bill Reel. I think Bill had paid him to do some animations for some videos, but there was some concern about the quality. And so there was a bit of a falling out there. And then I think he got into a spat, if you will, with Steve Pinecker and did some stuff that I think was distasteful in that regard. But it's like I said, I don't know much about that. I don't want to throw out accusations, and so I'm going to leave that section alone. In the same sense that I would want somebody to leave, like their personal lives or the personal, stuff of any of my buddies out of the issue. We're going to be talking primarily about his claims because that's, according to him, what he focuses on. All that really matters are the church's truth claims. And so I'm not gonna cause too much of a hassle there on that front. This is all just kind of background because some of this stuff actually relates to today's topic. So what specifically got my attention? I saw a video wherein he talked about the connection between the late war and the Book of Mormon. Uh, Primarily, he talked about several different source texts for the Book of Mormon, and this is a pretty common argument that I see levied by critics of the church, because they're unwilling to accept the idea that there's a spiritual domain wherein an angel appeared, be that as it may. Either if you're a general Christian, then you obviously don't believe an angel or true angel actually appeared and gave him the gold plates and God gave him the power to translate. Or if you're a secular critic, then angels are just all out. And so one of the common critiques is that they try to undermine the authentically ancient nature of the Book of Mormon by saying that Joseph Smith would plagiarize or use material from other books in that were local to his time or ideas in his general culture as a way to fabricate the Book of Mormon himself. So I watched both of these. I watched both of these videos, and the unfortunate reality is, as I mentioned before, there are several points wherein I think that there's some important information that's omitted. And I would also say that there's some fallacious reasoning included in these videos that I think should be worth addressing. And I hope to be able to talk about several of these different works and hopefully provide your viewers an additional tool whereby they're able to evaluate some of these claims and talk about research that discusses these kinds of connections. So with that in mind, this is an important thing too. So this is something I found on the very first video where he's talking about these connections. He argues that if there are any parallels to other texts in the Book of Mormon, it's precisely because Joseph Smith had access to these materials, and of course, by extension, is using those materials to fabricate the Book of Mormon. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. I wanted to talk a little bit about inspiration here for a second, though. And Robert, you can chime in on this point too. But here I have a picture of Paul preaching to the people. I want to say it's in Athens. And I want to say that he quotes a poet, but I forget the poet's name, where he talks about, are you not, yeah, he talks about everyone being children of God. So he's able to use an outside source to teach a specific principle. And even though Paul wouldn't necessarily be on the same page as this pagan poet, he would still be able to use that information to teach other people. And so, on one hand, there's a part of me that looks at this sort of idea of, oh, Joseph was inspired by these ideas as a kind of, as it not being useful or helpful or specific. Because on one hand, we believe that God can work through a variety of different means to teach people and prophets. But we also acknowledge the idea that if, for example, someone was to say that they had a vision And then we come to find out that, they just lifted, copy, pasted word for word from a book that they had been reading, then maybe we might have to take a step back and think to ourselves, well, hold on a minute, how much of this is actually inspired and like what is going on here? But at the end of the day, like I look at inspiration and, Latter-day Saint prophets as being very I look at that probably more loosely than other people because I'm someone who has no problem looking at inspiration and saying, oh yeah, God could totally, or a prophet could totally use this sort of thing in their local area and either co-opt it or make alterations to it in order to teach a specific principle. I feel like you can make a convincing argument that's what the New Testament authors were trying to do with the Old Testament texts about the Messiah. They were using those texts, and even though they were talking about arguably different things, the Old Testament authors were arguably talking about different things. We could view that as a very kind of dual fulfillment kind of typological reading. So, from an LDS theological perspective, this poses very little problem. This idea of inspiration of, oh, hey, prophets can actually interact with their surroundings, that poses very little problem. But
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think,
Um,
Robert?
no, I agree. By the way, the poet from Acts 17 is the 3rd century BC poet Aratus. Just
Got it.
Yeah. But you kind of mentioned, like, say, the Old Testament, like even the Old Testament prophets were cognizant of and interacted with, like, say, Canaanite texts and religious ideas. For instance, in Psalm 68, Yahweh or Jehovah said to be the rider of the clouds. That's a subversion and deconstruction directly of the Baal epic, where Baal is the rider of the clouds. And also, like, no one in their right mind should expect Joseph Smith to be, like, say, living in a vacuum where he's not interacting with the 19th century American restorationist culture that was, like, more than alive at that time. He would have been familiar, at least, with, like, say, the Campbellite movement and his religious background of his family. There was, like, a tear between the Universalists and the more Protestant leaning aspects of his family. So, the idea, like, say, he was influenced by sources or he was a product in some sense of his environment. It seems to be, if you think that, ipso facto, there can't be any revelation, but that's a false dichotomy. We do know from, like, the faithful traditional reading of church history, even, that events and texts spurred him on to receive explicit public revelation, like the word of wisdom, the debate about, like, tobacco, spitting, and Emma, or to use a textual example, John chapter 5 during the JST project being the uh, launch launching pad, if you will, or springboard for what is now Section 76. So, you know, I don't
No,
think there's, like, major issues there.
no, and I mean, certainly there is evidence to the idea that Joseph is interacting with local ideas in order to teach principles. But at the end of the day, regardless of what happens, at least some critical thinking is required. So if we're looking at this from the perspective of Latter-day Saints, we can look at what they're using different sources for, or what they allegedly would be using these sources for. So what would be the motivation for Joseph to use a specific source? So either Latter-day Saints would, in my mind, if we're looking at this from a critical perspective, Latter-day Saints would be interacting with this content to either support their worldview or use this content to set themselves apart from their neighbors. And none of this to say, though, is that even if they are doing that, or if we have instances of them doing that, that doesn't mean that that is ergo the source of those ideas. We'll talk about some examples of that specifically. But I think an analogy here is useful, and it has to do with something that he would know rather well, namely music. So in 2009, there was a commercial for the Reese's Puffs that had a rap song with a certain meter and beat. In 2010, the popular band Maroon 5 came out with the song Misery, using a similar meter and tempo as the commercial. Now, when people figured this out, they decided that they wanted to do something kind of fun with it. And I think it helps demonstrate this a little bit well. So that you can actually superimpose both songs on top of each other. So I'll play a little bit of that now. Hopefully we don't get an ad.
I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear any audio. So did you
You
click the
can't?
share
Oh,
audio?
that's so
Yeah.
sad. Well, the idea is that you can actually superimpose both of the songs on there. I'm concerned I'm going to
Okay.
get a copyright thing. Can you not hear any of the audio?
No, I couldn't hear the audio.
Oh, that's so sad. Hold on. Let's see. I wonder why I was able to do it with the first video and not the other one. That's weird. Anyway, that's a little disappointing. You guys should look it up though. The the problem is that you can find similarities between two different kinds of things. Like you can. It's something that our brains are really good at, actually. Someone who studies psychology, we're really good at being able to find patterns or find similarities between two things. But the unfortunate reality is that if we over-index on that, then we can find connections when there really aren't connections to be made, or not really strong ones. And the problem is that I found that Burke or Devers, or however we call him, bounces back and forth between direct evidence of things and like kind of circumstantial stuff that even he acknowledges at points isn't that strong, but cites them as a way to be able to attack the Book of Mormon. So let
And
me
of course,
see if I,
I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but Walt Whitman.
yeah, Leaves of Grass. Yes, I
Yes.
do. I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, Jeff Lindsay has a great page on like there's better explanatory power, quote unquote, for the parallels between Walt Whitman's 1855 Leaves of Grass and the 1830 Book of Mormon. It's satirical. Some people actually thought Jeff was being serious, but I think anyone who's bothered by like parallels, and some of which we'll definitely be discussing momentarily, should actually check that out.
Actually, hold on. I think I fixed the sounds. Let's see if this fixes it. Here.
So let me be, and I'll set you free. Reach this buck, eat 'em up, eat 'em up, eat 'em up. Reach this buck, eat 'em up, eat 'em up, eat 'em up.
Okay. So that was what I was trying to play. Like I said, you can impose different ideas, you can impose them on there, but that doesn't mean that one inspired the other. It just doesn't seem right. But we'll go ahead and we'll start with the first one. His very first source is that he cites Philosophy of a Future State by Thomas Dick. But we'll go ahead and play the video wherein he talks about this. Okay. Let's get the intro. Go.
Number 1, Thomas Dick's Philosophy of the Future State. This book taught that the universe is full of inhabited worlds governed by divine laws, concepts echoed in the Book of Abraham and in Doctrine and Covenants section 131. Joseph Smith owned this book, and he praised it in the church-owned publication, Times and Seasons.
Okay. Did you hear that okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So remember, keep in mind that this book, this video is specifically talking about sources for the Book of Mormon. But the weird part about this is that Philosophy of Future State, there's not really a good argument to be made that it influences the Book of Mormon in any way, shape, or form. So I don't think that he says that it supports it. Like it's like it seems odd to me that he would start by saying these are sources for the Book of Mormon, or these are potential sources even for the Book of Mormon, and then starts out by listing out a source that we're pretty sure had nothing to do with the Book of Mormon at all. And so I find that to be problematic. But it's interesting that Joseph Smith didn't praise this book himself. It was Oliver Cowdery who referenced it in the 1836 Times and Seasons, and we don't have records of Joseph interacting with this book in 1830. So again, we don't have evidence of him owning this book or perusing it or interacting with its content in any way prior to these kinds of references here. And we do he does make a note that he owned it, but the problem is that the only reason we know that he owned it was because he gave it away in like the mid 1840s, and so it's difficult to say that by extension, he had just held on to that book for 15 years, didn't say anything about it, and then proceeded just to give it away after that. This connection was first proposed by Fawn Brodie in her biography, No Man Knows My History, but he doesn't get into the specifics of that, and they actually contradict on a few separate points. So Fair actually has a page on this specific issue talking about certain differences between concepts as they're described in these texts. So it talks about creation, intelligences, nature of God, ability to comprehend God, nature of matter, that sort of thing. So you can make an argument that the nature of God thing we can just kind of write off because we don't see him launching into that primarily until later on. But if we're talking about intelligences, for example, very clearly, I mean, we see talk about intelligences very early in the 1830s. That's if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah, with Section 93, that's dated to sometime in 1833.
I was going to say, it was like 1832, 1833, something like that. So long before Joseph is interacting with, ideas for the Book of Abraham or for creation and that sort of thing, we see him directly contradict Thomas Dick on a couple of points, which suddenly prompts the question that if you're a critic, suddenly we have the question of, okay, why would he be referring to this if he's trying to use these sources to provide strength to his argument, which we know Joseph Smith was willing to do at least at times, then why is he saying stuff that's the opposite of what these sources are indicating? And I think that's an important question. Like, what are they trying to accomplish, or what would Joseph have to gain from doing that? And I don't find the benefits that Joseph would gain from trying to appeal to this to outweigh the potential cost of people coming back and say, hey, you said this is great, but this contradicts what you're saying. And so I find that to be an issue on that point. Let's see.
Also,
Yeah.
there's a very good master's thesis by Ted Jones, and I know Fair references
Yes,
it as well, from 1969, comparing and contrasting Thomas Dick's theology and writings with that of Joseph Smith.
Yes, and I will recommend that. I put that in the notes. I'm hoping to be able to send you the notes I have so that people can look at the links I'm looking at. Because I'm going to be citing quite a few different scholars today, and I'm of course going to be skimming over a lot of details. Of course, I would want to make sure that your viewers have access to all these materials.
What I'll do is I'll update the show notes and with a link to Dropbox with your notes afterwards.
Perfect. I love every aspect of that. So, Jeff Lindsay I want to say this was on his blog, but he talks about this potential connection between Abraham cosmology and philosophy of future state. I'll go ahead and read this really quick. For Dick, God's figurative throne was central in the universe, and the universe revolves around it. This contradicts the Book of Abraham, where the successive orders above the earth are described in the outermost, highest level being where we find Kolob. Kolob, near the throne of residence of God, is the highest, slowest level, governing the other bodies in lower levels, which rotate more quickly. This fixed reference point in this model is the earth upon which thou standest. Abraham's cosmology appears to be adapted to a geocentric model that the Egyptians can comprehend, suitable for the science of his era. It is radically different from Dick's cosmology, and the teachings on the throne of God seem diametrically opposed. In general, the parallels Brodie finds are so convincing are weak, not there, or virtually the opposite of what she claims. She and those who regurgitate arguments, that's probably a typo, my bad, on these points are simply wrong. And again, like if we go back and look at this, I think there's a really good argument to be made that we don't have evidence of Joseph interacting with this because of these kind of very weak connections, to the point where even more secular scholars like Benjamin Park even have a hard time with this. So he written an article on this. I thought it was interesting, but he notes that it is ironic that many of Dick's passages meant to be read as figurative ended up serving as a defense for Mormonism's literalism. So in this, he acknowledges the fact that these connections seem kind of superficial. At the same time, he also acknowledges the fact that it also goes against the idea that they're studying these texts and understanding them very closely. And so I found that to be a really interesting notion that he brought up because at the same time, he wrote that, while it's a mistake to identify Dick as the origin of Smith's theology of the soul, Mormon accounts of premortal existence were in print before the use of Dick's work. His argument is that they provided a larger theological framework. He still thinks that maybe it was used, but maybe it just provided some kind of language, if you will. I imagine it's similar to what an argument somebody would make of like Sidney Rigdon, incorporating like Campbellite ideas about two priesthoods and like providing names and a language and a framework wherein Joseph's ideas could more easily be summarized. But even then, I mean, that's both Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint scholars agreeing on the idea that this very likely was not used to derive a lot of these ideas for Abraham cosmology or other aspects of Joseph's revelations.
And for those who may be wondering who Ben Park is.
Oh, Benjamin Park, he was a Latter-day Saint. He's an American historian. He was a Latter-day Saint. It's my understanding he is no longer a Latter-day Saint. I want to say that
he's pretty inactive. I have a story to tell about him trying to get someone fired, but if anyone's curious about that, email me. But
it's like I said, it's important that we look at this sort of thing. If we look at the argument specifically, then I find it really compelling that we have a combination of Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint scholars affirming the idea that no, this isn't really a strong connection. And as we look at these texts more closely, it seems like these ideas are being derived somewhere else. And best case scenario for the secular perspective, these ideas are being used to kind of expand an idea, provide vocabulary for these ideas. But at the end of the day, I don't really see the connection here.
Yeah, and as you know, well, as he noted in the video, Joseph actually drew attention to Thomas Dick. That's kind of unusual for someone if they're directly plagiarizing from a source, like how the Times and Seasons drew attention to View of the Hebrews as well.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, Joseph Smith didn't necessarily write that. He didn't necessarily write that article wherein it was cited. It was Oliver Cowdery, but certainly he had editorial authority over that, and he had that published, which would be weird if he was actually plagiarizing that and didn't want anybody to find out about it. So there's that. But even if it wasn't there, like I wouldn't even need to like appeal to him doing that, because obviously he doesn't talk about all these different sources. That doesn't mean he's trying to hide them. But we would want to make sure that the parallels that are being drawn between these two things are strong enough to where it would validate the critique for them, a direct causality, as Berg indicated. But anyway, we'll go on to source number 2, Heaven and Hell by Emanuel Swedenborg. Now, let's take a look.
Number 2, Emanuel Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell. It describes 3 degrees of glory, eternal marriage, and a highly structured afterlife. These ideas reappear in Doctrine and Covenants section 76, as well as later LDS teachings on the afterlife.
Okay. So what's nice is that he keeps these very succinct so that we can just kind of bounce back and forth. But he refers to Emanuel Swedenborg's work. This isn't the first time this has been brought up, but we'll go ahead and take a look at this. So I find some problems with this on the grounds that, again, this doesn't necessarily talk a lot about the Book of Mormon, or he doesn't draw connections to it. I did find one specific writer try and draw connections to this idea of a spirit world being related in the Book of Mormon, and then also in Swedenborg's work. I wasn't really able to find anything else, but I mean, that's one potential connection to the Book of Mormon, I guess, but I don't think he does a good job of explaining how this relates to the Book of Mormon in any way. So again, we don't have records of Joseph interacting with this book prior to 1830. We do see him come in contact with people who liked Swedenborg's work after that point. But prior to that point, I don't think we have any evidence of Joseph Smith interacting with people who were familiar with those ideas or were exposed to those ideas specifically knowingly. I just don't think that we have that. If he has evidence to the contrary, I'd be deeply interested in hearing it. But that's my initial thought. So if there's a connection, it's likely secondhand, kind of like what I was saying. So Richard Bushman and J.B. Hawes both note that the connections between Swedenborg and Joseph's thoughts on eternal marriage and the three kingdoms are tenuous at best. I want to say that J.B. Hawes cites Rough Stone Rolling. I think there's a footnote in there to that, saying something to that extent. I think we'll get to that here in a second. Did you want to say something, Robert, though?
I will say this, like, I think the closest thing to like a Book of Mormon connection has been that purportedly both held to modalism, and that's the whole canard that like early Book of Mormon Christology was that modalism. And Swedenborg had this kind
Well, you
of
don't know anything
unusual.
about Book of Mormon modalism accusations, do you?
No, no, not like say I had two-part debate with Adam Stokes and a 3-hour discussion on Mormonism with Murph on this. But I know Rob Bowman has tried to argue like the Book of Mormon reflects Swedenborgian types of modalism, but even then, I don't think he says like it's a direct influence. It may just been like through osmosis or whatever. But even then, I think that's a stretch because the Book of Mormon does not teach any type of modalism. So there's no claim like Servetus or Swedenborgianism or what have you influence its Christology.
Yeah, and when I think of this, I'm looking at this from the idea of I'm agreeing with you, of course, that I don't think it teaches modalism. The idea that God the Father and Jesus Christ were the same person, so to speak. That's in Trinitarian theology. They're all one. They're the same. They're one person. They're not three persons. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that's modalism. Yeah.
Yes, it's the classic water, steam, ice analogy. Just all different modes of disintegrating.
Everyone check out St. Patrick's Bad Analogies from Lutheran Satire.
Very funny. I remember watching that and finding that enjoyable. To quote from J.B. Hawes, so he wrote an article talking about this exact thing. So Swedenborg did call the highest level of heaven the celestial kingdom. Yet because this was a common synonym for heaven in the Christian vernacular, it would seem a serious stretch to see this in shared vocabulary, a direct borrowing of Swedenborgian thought in Joseph Smith's writings. Joseph Smith based on his interpretation of the Pauline passage called the second kingdom or heavenly level terrestrial, while Swedenborg called that level spiritual. The phrase terrestrial bodies and the single word terrestrial do appear in Swedenborg's translated writings, but never do they describe or even refer to the inhabitants of the second or spiritual heaven. The words telestial, which Joseph Smith used to describe the lowest degree of heaven, never appears in Swedenborg's work, and indeed seems to be an invented word unique to Joseph Smith. Quinn, so that's D. Michael Quinn, because I think it was Quinn who first brought this up. In his review of similarities between Swedenborgianism and D&C 76, candidly admits that the names of the three glories, celestial, terrestrial, and telestial, in Joseph Smith's 1832 vision, only the celestial corresponded to Swedenborg's theology of three heavens. Yet asserts that Swedenborg stated that the inhabitants of the three heavens corresponded to the sun, moon, and stars. Such an assertion, if true, would seem to imply another Swedenborgian parallel. However, a review of Swedenborg's writings reveals that Quinn misappropriated or at least overstated the sun, moon, star description in Swedenborg's work. And subsequent writers may have too readily accepted Quinn's conclusions, thus exaggerating the perception of similarity. So, kind of long. We won't have too many of these kind of long quotes, but I think it was important to go over the idea that, hey, if we look at this stuff more closely, the words of like celestial or the three kingdom stuff, it really isn't all that strong. The connections there really aren't that strong.
Also, like the idea, like said, there's multiple heavens and stuff like that. That's been around since the patristic era. You have like Irenaeus on the apostolic preaching. You have Origen, whose years like 185 to 254 teaching the psychology on numbers and psalms, and others. You even have Francis Turretin, who's a Reformed theologian from the 17th century, basing his comments on 1 Corinthians 15, that there's differing degrees of reward in the hereafter as well. So it's not unusual. You don't have to like point to Emanuel Swedenborg's work to claim that there's a naturalistic influence behind Joseph Smith's revelation here. I mean, again, what is Joseph Smith basing a lot of this on? Basing expansion of 1 Corinthians 15, as well as
And
John
that's
5.
the conclusion that Hawes draws from this. So he says that it seems more likely that the direct influence for this was 1 Corinthians 15, and that because both of them are drawing from a similar influence, that being, of course, the biblical texts, Uh, that's why there's a similarity here. I mean, it's kind of interesting because on the other hand, or we'll get to that in a second. On the other hand, correct me if I'm wrong here, Robert, but Emanuel Swedenborg got a lot of his ideas because he allegedly had a vision of heaven, right?
Yeah, he claimed to be a visionary, and there's a denomination with the broad Christian spectrum that actually traces their origin to his writings.
And, far be it from me to question spiritual experiences in that regard. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a tricky situation when we talk about like independent, mutually exclusive claims that are brought about by these different by different visions, by different religions, that sort of thing. But at the same time, I'm also the kind of person that says, hey, the light of Christ works for everyone differently. If that's the sort of thing that's going to bring Emmanuel Swedenborg closer to God, and I don't believe he's going to rot in hell for all eternity, then I don't want to come down too harshly on Emmanuel Swedenborg for propagating some ideas. And for all we know, he could have had an actual vision, and he was just describing it the best way he possibly could. And so there are a variety of different ways Latter-day Saints can view this kind of connection here if we really want to squint and see if there's a connection here. I personally am not fully sold on the idea that there is a connection here. J.B. Hawes pulls a lot of his analysis from Craig Miller, where we get this idea of if there's any connection, it's likely secondhand, if any at all. So, if Swedenborg's teachings did have a profound influence on Joseph, I find it unlikely that Joseph would have received all his information about Swedenborg's teachings from the writings firsthand. So, first, his mother states that by the age of 18, he hadn't read the Bible, though, and was less inclined to reading than any of the other Smith children. Secondly, most new church members have only read a few of Swedenborg's works because, though interestingly, they're not easy to read. Joseph Smith may have been exposed to heaven and hell in English during his lifetime, or a digested review of Swedenborg's teachings. A digest of heaven or hell would seem unlikely source for some of the detailed information, like the use of priesthood robes and heavenly marriage, or the division of celestial heaven or kingdom in three. Neither of these ideas being found in heaven or hell, nor are these common topics of study among students of Swedenborg. So we'll go ahead and skip the second paragraph here. And I'm still, like I said, I'm inclined to agree with these scholars that it seems far more likely that Joseph is pulling these ideas from the Bible themselves. If he's pulling anything, he's pulling it from the Bible. I, of course, believe that when he actually does have a vision of the celestial and of the celestial kingdom and the other kingdoms, that he is actually having a vision. I mean, that's what I believe. But if you wanted to take a more secular approach to this, I think that you have a much better argument talking about him getting these ideas from the biblical texts than from these other books. So we'll keep going. View of the Hebrews. Let's see what he has to say about View of the Hebrews.
Number 3, Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews. This book proposed that Native Americans were descended from the lost tribes of Israel, featuring migrations from Jerusalem, epic wars, and sacred records. Joseph's close associate Oliver Cowdery's pastor was the one who wrote it.
Okay. So, View of the Hebrews. So, this might be a dumb question to ask, Robert, but is it safe to assume that you have read View of the Hebrews?
I have read it twice, and it has cured me of my insomnia. It is the most boring. It's one of the most boring books I have ever read, and I know you have some idea like the stuff I read. That says a lot.
Well, the good news is that we actually have something that's directly connected to the Book of Mormon. We're about halfway into the video now, and we finally have a source that's directly connected to the Book of Mormon. The problem, though, is, again, we don't have records of Joseph Smith interacting with this book prior to 1830, but we do have it later in 1842. Additionally, the connection between Oliver Cowdery and Ethan Smith is tenuous because we don't have records of the Cowdery family attending that church while Ethan Smith was the pastor. And that's one thing that really kind of bugged me about this video. He pulls up the title card for the Saints Unscripted video talking about the connections or the alleged connections between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. But in that video, David Snell does a very good job of pointing out the fact that Oliver Cowdery's family doesn't have any records of them attending that church when Ethan Smith was the pastor there. And then on top of that, we don't see any record of Joseph interacting with this. And Joseph had already started translating the text before Oliver Cowdery came onto the scene. And so you might be able to say, well, Joseph must have, quickly done some collusion with him. He must have been fed some ideas from Oliver Cowdery in order to be able to make it look more authentically ancient. Several problems with that. If that did happen, why did Oliver not say anything about it when he was excommunicated from the church? So there's that. And then also, just like the tone and the style of this is just completely off. I read it once, and I wish I could disagree with you about it being boring. It was basically just a dissertation, I don't want to say haphazardly tying scriptures together and then trying to impose those ideas, but it really did just, it doesn't seem very much like anything the Book of Mormon is at all. And
also,
we'll see
like, and not to cut you up, like, there's an entire chapter, like, purported words between Semitic languages and Amerindian languages, and not a single one of these words actually appear at all in the Book of Mormon. And this kind of ties into, like, say, something that critics can't really do a good job at explaining. And there's, like, say, the evidence from, like, say, the Anaskon and wordplays based on that, like the works of, say, Bob Smith and Matthew Bowen, for instance.
We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the Apocrypha. But because one of the things that they bring up, of course, is Nephi in the Apocrypha. So, we'll talk about that later. Sarah Allen did a good job in her response to the CES letter documenting several of the similarities and especially lots and lots and lots of the differences between these two books. Of course, if we're to take it that Burke is getting his information from the CES letter, it stands to reason that quoting the response to the CES letter would be appropriate here. Some of this sort of thing. So I want to talk about prophets. There was something on here about
sure. And while you find Ash, and
yes.
Everyone should check out the Mormon Or article and the primary research that was done by Stephen Smoot on this particular topic. You also learn a lot about Ethan Smith, who seemed to have been like a pretty awesome base guy. He was against slavery, for instance, which credit to him.
That's based, yeah. Yes. So here we I must have missed it, but one of the connections here, I think I have it on my phone. So, for example, one of the connections here is the restoration of the 10 tribes. We got it right here. So, View of the Hebrews states that all of the American Indians come from the lost 10 tribes, but in the Book of Mormon, Lehi's family descended from the tribe of Joseph, not necessarily the lost tribes. And it says the Book of Mormon actually directly contradicts it, saying that, hey, we don't know where these lost tribes are. So it kind of goes against this idea that they believe that the lost 10 tribes were, in fact, the inhabitants of the Americas, which would be weird, again, if Joseph is using this book to gain credibility among a more academic audience.
But funnily enough, like David Pursuit, one a critic who actually wrote Joseph Smith in the Origins of the Book of Mormon, said this similarity shows that there's evidence of borrowing, because this is like Joseph trying to cover his tracks, basically. So it's like what the British would say: heads I win, tails you lose.
I was gonna say the oh, you know what? I'm conflating this with no wonder I can't find it. I'm getting that confused with something in the late war. We'll get to that next. But I mean, if we're looking at this, like, encounter a valley of a great river, like, obviously, Hebrews compares crossing the Bering Strait to this, but at the same time, like, really, are we going to say that we couldn't get the idea of encountering a valley and a great river from anywhere but the View of the Hebrews? Like, it just doesn't seem like a very strong comparison to me.
And also it ignores, like, say, the Arabian Peninsula geography and the convergences from antiquity provided to support the authenticity of First Nephi. So yeah, you find there's mention of rivers and valleys, but Nahum, Bountiful, Shazer, the eastward turn. Again, the explanatory power is like negligible at best.
Yeah, I really struggle, especially with the View of the Hebrews connection. there's a different conversation to be had about the late war. I didn't realize that there was as much work on the late war as there was, I don't think. I was a little bit surprised by it. But what was disappointing to me primarily was this idea that a lot of these ideas just end up being propagated over and over again. But as we look at the texts, both of these texts more closely, we find that these texts are often saying something very different. And if they really are, different, and I guess I struggle to see the connections. That's what I'm trying to say. I could have said that better. That was my bad. But honestly, go look at Sarah's response. So look at Sarah's response. She has all of this documented. We'll put some of the I'll put that in the notes here too, so that people can look at that. She does a good job about outlining different stuff and summarizing the works of different authors in order to be able to compare some of these parallels. But I don't find the connection between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon to be convincing. Anyway, speaking of the late war, let's have a look.
At number 4, how about Gilbert Hunt's The Late War, a pseudo-biblical history of the War of 1812, mimicking King James English and including similar phrasing, tone, and battle scenes as the Book of Mormon. It's not plagiarism, but it proves that scripture-sounding war narratives were common.
Okay. So, regarding the late war. So again, we don't have records of Joseph owning this book, and there's a lot to be said here specifically. So this really got its footing when a couple of researchers by the name, I want to say it was Chris and Dwayne Johnson, not to be confused with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but just a pair of brothers who had done some statistical research on this and used a specific 4-gram statistical model to connect these books. So their argument is that the 4-gram statistical model, basically it's this idea of like forward phrases that are unique to both of these books, suggesting that there was a literary dependence on these texts. So, namely that the Book of Mormon had a strong relationship or was derived from the late war. The problem is that if you look at this more closely, there are significant problems with the n-gram statistical model used to connect these books. And the similar words and phrases are separated often by large blocks of texts, even to the tune of pages apart. And that seems problematic to me if you're going to say that, he's just copy pasting these narratives from this book. And then also for looking at the linguistic analysis of the Book of Mormon, it doesn't read very easily as a pseudo-archaic text. So we'll talk about Stan Carmack's work here in just a second. But I'll make a reference to, of course, Benjamin McGuire. Shortly after this research was presented by the Johnsons, he wrote this really good article in Interpreter discussing this idea about the problems using the statistical model. And I don't have time to go over all of the stuff. It's a decently sized article. As you can see, we're talking to the tune of over 30 pages. But I would recommend that people take a look at that specifically. Did you want to add something in there, Robert? I noticed you turned the camera on. I can't hear you, boss.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Ben McGuire has done excellent work on how to evaluate parallels between texts over the years. He actually has a very good article on the Solomon Spaulding website, of all places, called Parallelomania, Criticism of the Textual Parallels Theories, where he does a very good job at summarizing, like, say, modern-day scholarship like Richard B. Hayes and Ben Summer on the tests of how to evaluate if a text is dependent upon another text. So that's a good source. But yeah, Ben has done excellent work on this. And I'm hoping his stuff on Proto-Deuteronomy sees the light of day. He's been working on that for years. So
Really?
yes.
I'd be interested in reading that. But I'm just looking at this, look at my notes here real quick. Yeah, so I won't, like I said, I won't go too deeply into Ben McGuire's work. I also know that there was another article, kind of blog post for all intents and purposes written on Interpreter's site wherein somebody did a Bayesian analysis of this to evaluate what the n-grams probability would actually increase the probability, evaluating the strength of this argument that the late war did evaluate this. He found that it was maybe like it increased the chance or the probability that Joseph used it by maybe 10 to 12%. But that's not a very significant effect size, in my opinion. Like if we're talking about that, I
that's
just don't
by
know that.
G. Bruce Salalje. I'm guessing Schaalje, a Bayesian ceasefire in the late war in the Book of Mormon from 2013.
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, we'll put these in the notes below. But I would honestly take a look at this. I think you would all appreciate it. This is a quick little example. I pulled this from David Snell's video on the late war, which I know he has watched, because in another video, he cites this very portion of the video talking about how a lot of these connections and a lot of these words are separated by blocks of text, which bugs me a little bit because he then proceeds to turn around and then talk about all of the different connections, knowing full well that a lot of these connections are stretched apart by strings and often, pages of text. And so I have a hard time with that. I don't find that to be, I can easily see people being misled by bouncing back and forth in the way that he does, trying to make it look like there's a connection when as we look at this more closely, there doesn't seem to be. Let's go through here. A couple of connections. I took a couple of notes, so you guys can take this for what it's worth. So in the late war, 3 Indian prophets acted as inspiration for the 3 Nephites, according to this theory. But it's weird because the 3 Nephites in the Book of Mormon are righteous, but the 3 Indian prophets were not righteous. I want to say that the story goes is that they actually deceived some of the locals there. So it's weird that he would take that and then proceed to do something completely different with it. Weapons of war are described as curious workmanship. In the late war does this, but the Book of Mormon does not. The Liahona is not a weapon, and Ether's 10's use of curious workmanship isn't really about weapons either. Yeah, and then also like another connection that's made by the Johnsons is that the 4th of July is mentioned in both the Book of Mormon and the late war, which I didn't pick up on before. Like honestly, the Book of Mormon has so many dates. Like it also makes a reference to the 3rd day of the 7th month, which is where they're getting the 4th of July from. But I don't see that as being like a strong connection just by virtue of the fact of how many dates there are. Honestly, the strongest connection I'd actually be willing to consider is actually like the 2,000 warriors that are described in both. Having looked at both texts, if I squint, I can kind of see that. At the same time, though, there are lots of, numbered troops and units described in the biblical texts too. And so I see that as being just as likely as being a coincidence of, hey, 2,000 seems like a big number. It increases to 2,060 later on in the text. Like I don't necessarily see that as being a very strong connection, and that's probably one of the better ones I found. We'll go ahead and keep going though. Oh yes, so chiasmus. You will see critics. It's not just the Johnsons. It's not just Mormon News Roundup that does this. Other critics like Bill Reel will appeal to this. What I find to be really interesting, though, is that you have other critics who say, no, this really isn't a chiasm. So, interestingly enough, Julia from Analyzing Mormonism, who I listen to every now and again, I don't love a lot of her work. It does seem rather biased to me negatively, which makes sense considering how she got her start, I think, with John DeLynn and Mormon Stories. At the same time, though, like she even says, hey, listen, these phrases don't necessarily exist. There's not like a central theme to the chiasm. And so it doesn't really match up in any kind of strong way. And so them trying to use this to say, hey, look, chiasms don't prove ancient authenticity of these texts is a little bit misleading in regards to the fact that they have to stretch this text far more than anything that I think would be warranted or fair. And so it's a problem that I have with the Johnson's research on this.
Yeah, and like chiasmus, like in ancient texts, even presenting from like the Book of Mormon, acts as an interpretive device. And it doesn't seem like, say, there's any purpose to these quote unquote chiastic structures that they find in the works of Hunt and others. It's now I'm in the camp, like, I do believe that there is such thing as like intentional chiasmus in antiquity, and I do believe intentional chiasmic structures appear in the Book of Mormon, even if like some LDS apologists have like blown the implications of that over. They've been a little too enthusiastic about what it means. Like one well-known LDS apologist who I actually do respect said it single-handedly disproves the thesis of the 19th century production, which I think is a stretch.
Yeah, that is a bit of a stretch. But
at the same time, just looking at the structure, there's no genuine turning point. There's no interpretive or exegetical aid that this purported chiasmus presents, and so forth. So it's, to use a term like the SJW stuff to use, it's problematic.
Well, I've used the term problematic a couple of times. Does that make me social justice for you?
Let's not try to get the stream taken
Please
down.
don't answer that. Actually, please don't. I'm scared of you.
What's your views on?
I'll add this in though. I did an interview with Carl Cranny on FAIR. He was kind enough to come in and present some of the work that he had done on kind of the intentionality aspect of these chiasms in the Book of Mormon, and came to find, and it was a really great interview. I could not more strongly recommend his work on this, because I just thought it was the coolest thing. Because what he found was that all of these kind of parallelisms and this Hebrew poetry, these Hebrew poetry forms, were found in more oral dictations of things instead of like block text or letters, so to speak, or that sort of thing. He found that there was a significant increase in that kind of language in specifically oral dictations. And what that demonstrates is that intentionality aspect. And so it's really difficult at that point to say that these chiasms find themselves in the Book of Mormon accidentally, when statistically speaking, we can measure that sort of thing and find really compelling evidence to the idea. I want to say like the p-value was like 0.03 or something like, so statistically significant. Can't just write this off as being a placed there intentionally. Now, a critic might say, oh, well, that means just Joseph must have known about the chiasm, Hebrew poetry forms, and must have incorporated them. Okay, you could say that, but then suddenly you have to support the idea of, okay, where is he learning this from? Where is he getting his information from? Did anybody notice him get his information, and why did nobody call it? Because I don't think that we have that sort of thing on their radar in early criticisms of the Book of Mormon. Because it's my understanding that most of the early criticisms of the Book of Mormon actually have to do with the fact that they don't think it's a very sophisticated book. And they think that Joseph, actually, no, they do think it's sophisticated, but they think Joseph Smith is an idiot, and they don't think that he wrote it himself. So if we're seeing that like the earliest records we have of Joseph Smith suggest that he wasn't super well read, and also, well, not that he was stupid. I do think his literary abilities can be downplayed a little bit too much sometimes, but at the same time, I don't think that we have strong evidence of this idea that Joseph is, secretly studying Hebrew textbooks and is actually, just getting all this information in a way that would be easy to replicate. But that's what I think. Again, you can take a look at Fair's article. They have a pretty decent article on this. Yes. So Stanford Carmack wrote an article several years ago that I have loved. And it's really long and it's really technical. But those are some of the best ones sometimes.
What are you talking about? It's only 55 pages.
But what he does is he actually does an analysis of the Book of Mormon language and compares it to other pseudo-archaic texts. And he calls out some of the problems with the engram stuff that is used by the Johnsons again. And what he found is that the Book of Mormon is mimicking a kind of language that is fundamentally distinguished from both the Bible and also these pseudo-archaic texts, namely the First Book of Napoleon and the Late War. And to the point of where he says that he finds it indefensible because of the large amount of contradictory descriptive linguistic data, of the kind that has high probative value, which is, of course, to say, if you look at the numbers, it's really, really, really likely that Joseph Smith isn't pulling his ideas of like pseudo-archaic language from these texts. Now, there's an article written by, I want to say it was Nicholas Frederick, that critics will sometimes appeal to. And they've done poor Professor Frederick dirty with that. So I want to say he wrote an article in the Journal of Mormon History talking about the Colesville letters and comparing those letters to the text of the Book of Mormon to talk about literary sophistication. What he found was, shocker, that after completing the Book of Mormon, he was speaking in ways that sounded very similar to the Book of Mormon. And that makes sense to me. That doesn't mean that he had an in-depth idea about these biblical texts. In fact, the article says very clearly that he was prioritizing stuff that sounded biblical as opposed to actually quoting from the biblical texts themselves. So even if we were to take it from that point of view, trying to say that he's deriving this from the Bible or even these pseudo-archaic texts really falls apart as you look at it more closely. But that doesn't necessarily stop a lot of these critics from propagating this information around. And I again have a really hard time with that when we have really good evidence suggesting that the Book of Mormon is far more complex than these texts, much longer than a lot of these texts, and I just don't think we have strong evidence of him pulling from them. But I think we can jump over to the next one, the first book of Napoleon, unless you have something you want to chime in there, Robert.
Yeah, I will just say for this and also the first book of Napoleon, which we'll be discussing, in spite of, like, say, the superficial similarities between that and, say, the Book of Mormon's biblical language, again, there's no explanatory power as to, say, the names and other linguistic considerations you find in the Book of Mormon that can't be explained away through borrowing from, like, the Late War or the Book of Napoleon or even the King James Version of the Bible.
Right. But we'll go ahead and jump back over.
Number 5, the first book of Napoleon. It also used faux King James Version language, starting chapters with, "And it came to pass," and invoking divine destiny for a chosen people. Again, showing that Joseph wasn't unique in adapting biblical ideas to modern themes.
Okay. So we're back to another pseudo-archaic text, namely the first book of Napoleon. He does kind of riff off of this a little bit, though. Because, yeah, there we are. That's fine. So there are several problems with this. Again, we don't have records of Joseph owning the first book of Napoleon, which is, again, strange. And I know I keep on harping on this point. I'm bringing this up primarily because I know that Burke brought up the fact that A Philosophy of a Future State was owned at least for portions of Joseph's life. And so if we're going to be consistent in how we're applying that criteria, it's worth noting that we don't have records of Joseph owning most of these books or, being familiar with a lot of these ideas directly. So most of the thematic connections are weak. Even the very people supporting the late war theory say the connection between the first book of Napoleon and the Book of Mormon aren't really strong. They said the same thing about Solomon Spaulding's work. So if we're really going to take this sort of thing seriously, and we're going to be looking at the connections between these books, and we were to use the very scholars that Burke is pulling from here, like it's just not there. And if we're having non-LDS and LDS scholars agree with that, then we should really take that under consideration. The similar words and phrases are connected by several blocks of unrelated text. This is the source, by the way, of me pulling up this idea that the Johnsons, or one of them actually said that the first book of Napoleon and Solomon Spaulding's manuscript found, but they couldn't find any close source of textual transmission. They were more out of place and less explainable for the Book of Mormon. But even if we were to look at this, so this is me again pulling from the text. This is me pulling from David Snell's video, which again was cited or referenced by Burke in his video, where we have on this one I want to say on the left we have the Book of Mormon. We have that again scattered across several different pages. But I brought this one up here because, as you can see, in order to arrive at this, Nephi narrative that you get from the first book of Napoleon, you have to pull from the first 21 pages in order to be able to get all of the correct phrases there. And I just don't think that's a reasonable thing to assume, that Joseph is just like saying, hey, what's going to work here? Abroad. Yes, I'm going to put abroad in here. Like, I struggle to see that sort of connection. Maybe they understand something I don't, but I just don't think that's a reasonable thing to take into consideration. And then, of course, C. Stan Carmack's work, he talks about the first book of Napoleon. It really doesn't have a lot of explanatory power. Ah, yes. Nature and Providence. Wonders of Nature and Providence, I should say. Oh, one more thing. Just to let everybody know. So he cites Eliakim the scribe for the first book of Napoleon. It actually, that's a pseudonym. The guy's name is Michael Linning. I just am a little bit concerned that he just looked it up at something. He didn't know who the author was, despite the fact that it's repeatedly explained in various places. I question the amount of depth he's putting into the research then if he's not able to get details like that or mention details like that. I would wish that he would have explained that sort of thing and then talk about things like the educational background of Michael Linning and that sort of thing. But anyway, we'll move on. Sorry about that.
Number 6, Josiah Priest's Wonders of Nature and Providence. This book promoted the idea that Native Americans were descended from Old World peoples, a central premise in the Book of Mormon. And this book also ties into the then popular mound builder myth.
Okay. So, Wonders of Nature and Providence by Josiah Priest. All right. So I find several problems with this. Again, no record of Joseph owning this. Many of the thematic connections made between these books are weak. And while it's objectively true that Native Americans do come from another continent, I mean, the idea is that, they're descended from like Asiatic peoples who crossed over the through pretty high up north. I forget what the Bering Strait, I think. Is that right? I think so. But even if we were to steelman that argument, the connections made between Native Americans and Israelites and the mound builder myths are a little bit short-sighted. I think they're missing a couple of important aspects. So I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts on this one in particular. So a narrow neck of land is one of the things that are connected between the Book of Mormon and this specific book, The Wonders of Nature and Providence. Again, narrow neck of land, I don't think that's really a strong literary comparison here. They talk about the darkness, which may be felt, very thick darkness. And then they say, oh, that's another inspiration for what we find in the Book of Mormon. But what's really interesting to me is we're going to talk a little bit about Adam Clarke's commentary later. But one of the things that this suggests to me is that Burke isn't necessarily consulting a lot of these faithful sources that are even easy to access, because he's more than happy to cite later that Adam Clarke commentary was used to create the Book of Mormon. We'll talk about that. I don't think that's true. But the fact that Fair would acknowledge the fact that some of these phrases were used in books like Adam Clarke's commentary, but Burke doesn't mention that, despite the fact it would be a really easy way to gain points, so to speak, suggests to me that he's not looking at this very carefully.
By the way, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure if you mentioned this. I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but guess you interacted with the Book of Mormon a few years after Wonders of Nature came out.
Who?
Josiah Priest, these book American Antiquities. He critiques it, but he never actually insinuates there's any direct borrowing or any type of borrowing between his earlier work and the Book of Mormon.
That is really good. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Of course, here I am critiquing somebody for not knowing something when I don't know something. That's my bad.
Sure. This is the 1834 edition of American Antiquities. It's page 73 of the one that's on archive.org. Matthew Roper actually pointed this out back in 1992 when he reviewed the chapters on the Book of Mormon from Shadow Reality by the Tanners.
No, I think that's really, really interesting. I didn't know that. But again, that goes to show if they were really that similar, you would expect Josiah Priest to be more in agreement with the book and not less in agreement with the book. So there's that. Regarding the mound builder myth, Brent Gardner made a comment that I think was useful, and it goes with the theme of kind of today's presentation. Of course, one might still suspect that Joseph made up stories based on the mound builders, but that is an interpretation laid over the evidence, not a conclusion that flows from it. And Brent Gardner has done a really good job talking about kind of the Mesoamerican model of this. And of course, the Mesoamerican model of the Book of Mormon and the complexity on that front has to do, I think goes far and beyond anything that would have been derived from just haphazardly thinking about the mound builder myth. And so I would recommend people to take a look at that work as well. But you also have even witnesses of the Book of Mormon making a note of the fact that if this was an idea that was prevalent, the Book of Mormon doesn't necessarily support it. So, for example, when David Whitmer says that when we, the witnesses, were first told to publish our statement, we felt sure that the people would not believe it, for the book told of a people who were refined and dwelt in large cities. But the Lord told us that he would make it known to the people, and the people should discover evidence of the truth of what is written in the book. So I also, going back to the analogy of like the music stuff that we were talking about in the beginning, it is very easy for us to make connections between things. And honestly, I'm not even really opposed to the idea that Joseph is at least partially influenced, even later in life, by some of these ideas. The whole Zelph, the White Lamanite story. You can make a really good argument that that's at least partially inspired by the idea that they believe that the Book of Mormon is taking place on a continental scale and that the mountains maybe have something to do with it. At the same time, I don't think that that sort of interpretation or Joseph believing that would have any bearing on what the content of the Book of Mormon itself states. I think you've made a reference to something like that before, like the translationalist fallacy or something like that. You remember what I'm talking about, Robert?
I'm sorry, could you repeat? Sorry, the audio is bad. Could you repeat that again?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was talking about the interpretationist fallacy, or I think that's what you called it, where like
the
translator
intentionist.
fallacy.
Oh, the intentionist fallacy, where
Intentionist fallacy. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
where the intention of a translator is supposedly privileged, basically. But Joseph, as you know, was like an interpreter of the text of the Book of Mormon. He had to learn, as did everyone else. So even if you believe, like, say, it was like a pure direct revelation or what have you, he still had to interpret that himself.
Yeah. And if we're saying, if it's one of those things where the Book of Mormon is kind of weird, because if you study it, you kind of sort of need to make up your mind beforehand before you actually do kind of serious research about it. Because if you walk into it assuming that it's just a 19th century fabrication, then the way to study this and the way to look at it is to draw connections to stuff going on exclusively in the 1800s. But if it is in fact an authentically ancient document, which I think it is, and I think there's evidence supporting that idea, I would say that, getting somebody like Brant Gardner on the scene or John Sorensen talking about like this in the Mesoamerican way, I think that's really helpful. But as we look at this more closely, I don't think that, obviously, if David Whitmer has concerns or if the witnesses have concerns about how this is going to be taken in light of the fact that even in spite of the fact that we have the ideas like the mound builder myth being brought about, then I struggle to see that I struggle to see that this is a direct causality of this idea. So yeah, well, you can take that for what it's worth, but the books of Enoch. So let's take a look at that.
Number 7, the books of Enoch. Though not canonized into the Bible, they were summarized and circulated before 1830, telling of a visionary prophet who ascends to heaven and learns cosmic truths. Parallels to this book are found in Moses chapter 6 and 7 and the book of Abraham's Kolob cosmology.
Okay. I'll leave that there. So this is one of the connections that he makes that I have a really hard time understanding. So again, we're back to this has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. Sorry. And I have no idea where he's getting the Kolob cosmology idea from. Admittedly, though, I've read Jeff Bradshaw's book on Enoch and the Gathering of Zion, which is a fantastic book. Like he does a really good job about talking about how these different texts do line up with what scholars say about Enochian literature, and then also what the primary sources themselves say. So maybe it's cringe that I've read a secondary source before I read the primary source. If so, you can laugh at me. This is now the time to do that.
If I had to stretch things, it's because like astral bodies play a very important cosmological, theological role in one Enoch. So, importance of stars, Kolob. It's a stretch.
I was gonna say, like we'll talk about this here in a second, because but before we get there, we have Second Enoch and Third Enoch and Book of the Giants were all discovered after Moses 6 and 7 and Abraham 3 were written. And I want to say that Burke is getting his information from Colby Townsend's work on this, because I think he's tried to draw connections between the primarily Enoch texts and then the Moses narrative.
Yeah.
I don't find Colby Townsend's work very convincing on that. Besides the fact that maybe there were portions of First Enoch that may have been more available than we previously anticipated. But the problem is that you can't really get around the fact that the connections that we see between Second Enoch, Third Enoch, and Book of the Giants are all really strong and were all done before those texts were discovered. And so I really have a hard time getting at. Here's the thing. When I first read it, Colby Townsend's work, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm wondering if there are any Latter-day Saint scholars who have rebutted this specific idea. And it turns out that they did. So first things, we'll deal with the Kolob cosmology thing. So John Gee wrote in his introduction to the Book of Abraham, talking about this idea that it has a geocentric model for the stars. And again, according to this Egyptian idea of cosmology. So with this in mind, it's my understanding that First Enoch does not have a geocentric model. It's still Hebrew influenced, and by extension would still have this idea of like the firmament. And admittedly, I'm a little bit fuzzy on, like I said, I haven't read First Enoch myself, but it's my understanding that the Kolob cosmology there would directly contradict what Old Testament cosmology would represent when talking about things like the firmament, the sun being inside the dome, for example. Like, I just don't know if we can really draw that kind of connection there.
You're correct about the cosmology. So
okay, phew. I'm sorry. I sometimes get my cosmological terms mixed up. So,
and by the way, for those who want, like, there's a good 2-volume commentary / translation of 1 Enoch by Nickelsburg as part of the Hermenea series. So if you want a good scholarly translation commentary, that's what I would go with.
I will make a note of that. Okay, great. Thank you. ChatGPT was kind enough to give me the dates when all of these were discovered. So, yay. As you can see, the first Enoch was brought to Europe in 1773. Colby Townsend has tried to make the argument that some of them were put in commentaries like the Adam Clarke commentary or stuff that maybe Joseph had access to. Again, though, that's certainly not the case for Second Enoch, discovered in like the 1880s, something like that. Third Enoch later, Book of the Giants much later. So we have the question, where is Joseph getting this information from? Now, maybe one day we discover a source. Okay, maybe. But until that time, you really have a hard time being able to say that Joseph was deeply influenced by this and was, by extension, getting his information from these texts, when we know for a fact that a lot of these texts just weren't discovered then. So take that for what it's worth. One thing that I will try to address preemptively. I want to say that what's his name? Not Colby. It's another Colby. Colby Reddish. You've heard of Colby Reddish?
Yes, I have.
He's been buddying up with Bill Reel and Company pretty recently. He left a very mean review on a video I made. Made me sad. But he had made the observation that, we shouldn't really care about the Enoch parallels because all the Enochian literature is just pseudepigrapha anyway. And so it's not authentically ancient. So it doesn't matter if if Joseph's work is actually connected to that.
But Enochian
But
literature is like 2nd to 3rd century BC onwards.
well, we know for a fact that at least first Enoch is. And you might be able to, I know that different scholars have different takes on that. I mean, but we have a lot of these traditions predating that time. And we're not making the argument that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Robert, when we're talking about those kinds of parallels, we're talking about the Book of Moses being a restoration of an ancient text. And we would argue that the ancient text is what First Enoch, Second Enoch, and all the pseudepigraphal texts is being derived from.
Or at least they would share, like, say, the same theological culture milieu. Yeah.
Yes, and so be that as it may, I still think that you can't just hand wave it. You can't hand wave away this specific kind of literature. You can't hand wave away the connections because as we look, again, we have Jeffrey Bradshaw's work here, where we see him very clearly and kindly interact with the Book of Enoch work that's done by Colby Townsend. But as we look at like major storyline events, we have the Book of Moses talk about several different aspects of these texts and how they relate exclusively to the Book of the Giants. For example, dreams, and then also I want to say it was the Mahuja work, like the work on the person Mahija, Mahuja, Mawe, that sort of thing. And I just think that's really interesting. But honestly, he has a longer kind of response to the availability of one Enoch. But the short answer is that it's a little bit tenuous. So, for example, we have Latter-day Saints feeling very, very surprised, for example, when they first encounter Enochian literature. So Parley Pratt in 1840 came in contact with First Enoch and was really, really kind of taken aback by it. We have Joseph Smith not pulling from passages in Jude, for example, quoting Enoch. So if he's trying to create a convincing forgery, why is he not incorporating some of those passages into his Moses narrative? So again, lots of questions end up being brought up. While at the same time, I think Bradshaw does a good job about like trying to be charitable to Colby Townsend's work. Well, this isn't the last time we'll run into Colby Townsend though in this live stream. So we'll kind of leave that there. But let's get to one of the elephants in the room, the KJV and the Book of Mormon. So we'll talk about that.
At number 8, we've got the King James Bible and the Apocrypha. These are directly quoted in the Book of Mormon, including known King James Version translation errors. Stories from the Apocrypha also show up, further rooting the Book of Mormon in available sources of the day.
Okay. All right, Robert. So just a heads up, I'm getting some messages here. I might have to call it here in the next 30 minutes. So we might have to rush this last part a little bit. I'm sorry about
That's
that.
fine.
But when we're talking about the KJV and the Apocrypha, there are lots of things that we should be referring to when we're talking about the composition of the Book of Mormon in conjunction with that. So first off, if we're looking at this idea of the Book of Mormon matching the Bible, I would actually say that's more of a feature, not a bug. You actually have several Latter-day Saint thinkers and scholars who have at least been friendly to the idea that Joseph Smith used an actual Bible during the translation. They've at least been friendly to the idea. I don't think it's out of the question that Joseph was influenced by this. Again, because we believe that there is a kind of conjoined theology that we derive from each of these texts. And, Joseph very clearly believed that he was restoring this ancient stuff. And of course, if the ancient stuff therefore matches the Bible, then that makes sense. So in terms of the translation, that's something we should take into account. Oh, Robert, I forgot about this. So one of the people that Burke cites to talk about plagiarisms really kind of shocked me, admittedly, because he cites Paul Guy. Um, what this suggests to me is that he has no idea who Paul Guy is. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I'm trying to be nice and make sure this gets monetized, but yes.
Um, Tell you what, Burke, if you're watching this, watch Jacob Hansen's debate on the Trinity with Paul Guy, and then come back and tell me who knows more about the Bible and the Book of Mormon. That's all I'm going to say. Take that for what you will.
Just on the issue, like, say, King James translation errors and stuff like that, I've addressed a lot of that in responding to David Wright and his essay in American Apocrypha, like whether there's like KJV errors or errors as a result of the interacting with the italicized words in the Isaiah text of the Book of Mormon as well. I think the number of instances are a stretch. There's a couple maybe, but the most egregious common examples critics cite don't really hold up if you actually know textual criticism and the original languages.
I remember looking at some of that myself when I was on my mission. I was curious to see, because I want to say the CES letter has like a list of common KJV error stuff. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But the what is really interesting is when we're talking about a direct use of these texts, so we have to acknowledge the fact that we have multiple primary sources and witnesses to the translation saying Joseph did not have any notes or books or manuscripts with him during the translation. So Emma Smith says it. And she goes so far as to say that if he had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. Now, critics try to hand wave away Emma's testimony by saying, oh, well, that's the same testimony where she lied about plural marriage and the saints. So, we can't trust anything she says. Admittedly, I'm not fully sold on the idea that Joseph Smith III had no hand in representing some of those thoughts about polygamy while leaving the rest of that stuff untouched. I want to see Brian Hill talked about that.
Just in that, let's say in arguments, Emma was lying through her teeth. In a court of law, her testimony would be thrown out, but from a historian's perspective, you take it on a issue by issue basis. So yeah, let's just say she lied through her teeth about polygamy. There's historical, social, theological reasons why she did that. But why would she lie about, like, say, the source materials or lack thereof for the Book of Mormon and so forth? This is something like Dan Vogel and others have also raised as well. You don't throw out entirely Emma's testimony when it comes to the other issues discussed in that testimony. Again, court of law, yes, but a court of law and how you do history are not one-to-one equivalent. You take it on a issue-by-issue basis in a document or an affidavit.
Especially if that information is corroborated by other sources. So, for example, Oliver Cowdery's first wife, Elizabeth Ann Whitmer Cowdery, states that Joseph didn't have a curtain and that he didn't have any specific, let's see. I was going to say, so he was completely visible at that point. So if there was something there, people would have noticed. That's my point. But we'll go ahead and keep going. So I'm going to skip 9 and 10's part of the video because what he does is he just rapid fires a bunch of stuff off about potential connections there. But if we have revivalism, religious excitement, racial myths, American exceptionalism, and he says esoteric ideas like Freemasonry. And the problem is that a lot of this stuff you don't necessarily need to be alive in the 1800s to be familiar with. I mean, religious excitement. I mean, there's all kinds of religious excitement and
yeah, and many of the themes in the Book of Mormon, they're not unique to the 19th century. Like the debates about, like, say, whether young children should be baptized. That's the debate that's been going on in the Christian time since at least Tertullian, and he's years here 160 to 220. or like debates about the nature of the Eucharist, or ecclesiology. They're not unique to the 19th century as well. And again, none of these actually have the explanatory power of explaining the Olam Nazca of the Book of Mormon and other linguistic considerations, or the Arabian Peninsula geography, or Jerry Grover's work vis-a-vis geology and the Book of Mormon, or that of Sorensen and Garner. It's really two-dimensional at most. It's kind of the movie uh, Pesci, where he plays a solicitor who sleeps and he's trying to convince his client not to fire him. It's like the prosecution will present this card, and they'll show the jury has wit and they'll show the jury has length, but they won't show the other aspect that it doesn't have depth. And that's the case when it comes to the Book of Mormon. The critics can show, like, say, and the came to pass appears in other texts, or there's speculation about like Indian origins, but they're either not going to, or they're going to do a half-assed job at explaining the evidences for the verisimilitude and historicity of the text that you don't find in, say, View of the Hebrews or the King James Apocrypha or what have you.
No, I agree with that. The thing when we're talking about, for example, racial myths, for example, that's just one of the things. People will, of course, appeal to texts like 2 Nephi 5, and then additional ones. The thing is, I want to say it was it Daniel Belknap who did an article in Interpreter looking at that issue more closely. I'm trying to remember which Interpreter article it was, but there was one that I was really impressed with, discussing this very issue and talking about the significant problems with assuming that the skin in that sense has to do with skin color, namely with narratives in the Book of Mormon relying on people being able to confuse Nephites and Lamanites just based on appearance. And so, like, I don't see that as being a very, again, as you look at it more closely, you find that a lot of these parallels end up falling apart. Again, though, when we're talking about this, I mentioned the whole false dichotomy of revelation thing. Again, we don't think Joseph Smith lives in a vacuum. If he's talking about this sort of thing, he could very well have been talking about it in terms that people would understand. Like, I just don't think that would be a problem. But about the Freemasonry thing, Jeffrey Bradshaw makes a reference to a book by Cheryl Bruno, Joe Steve Swick III, and Nicholas S. Litursky, talking about correctly challenged the common assumption that Joseph Smith drastically reversed his views of Masonry over time, remaining anti-Masonic during the period of Mormon translation to fully adopting Masonry in the final years. I agree with their conclusion. Martin Harris erred when he allegedly characterized the Book of Mormon as an anti-Masonic Bible. What this suggests to me is that the common thing here, and maybe Burke believes this, maybe not, but I would like to be able to deal with this preemptively if I can, is this idea that Joseph is incorporating this idea of anti-Masonry in the Book of Mormon. I've heard that before. But if you look at this more closely, again, I just don't think that's true when we have a combination of really reputable scholars indicating otherwise. And then we're on the last one, the Adam Clarke commentary as a potential source for the Book of Mormon. And we'll spend a decent amount of time on this because I think it's one that's gotten a lot of attention recently. Okay. Here we are.
The Adam Clarke's commentary on the Bible. This was a widely used source that Joseph appears to have drawn from both in the Book of Mormon and the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Scholars from BYU, including Thomas Wayment and Haley Wilson Lemon, have found strong evidence of direct borrowing. So to get back to my original...
Okay.
It should be noted, they're the only researchers in BYU, and Lemon is not in BYU anymore. So it's kind of like the whole that sitcom that's popular in America. There's dozens of us. Actually, there's only 2 at most.
Well, here's the deal. Like, if we're looking at the Adam Clarke commentary, we've actually talked about the Adam Clarke commentary before on this very channel when we did our response to Bill Reel. But significant problems. We don't have evidence of Joseph owning this commentary. The conclusion that Joseph Smith is drawing on the Adam Clarke commentary is drawing its foundation from the idea that Joseph used it for the JST, which is already problematic. Thanks to some of the research that's been done on this. And the parallels that are drawn between the Adam Clarke commentary and the Book of Mormon are likewise demonstrated to be tenuous. So Was there plagiarism? The answer is probably not. So this is actually pretty much a copy paste from the slide that I did previously talking about this, wherein Thomas Wayman says that it's not plagiarism. And then I also cite the article from Kent B. Jackson, who reviews each of those. I want to say that you gave that article a B plus or something like this, or an A minus.
Yeah, that, and I still stand by that. I mean, overall, I don't think there's any direct evidence or direct barring, but something that should be investigated, although it would have to be very nuanced, is like how much of this could be through osmosis via Sidney Rigdon, because we do know Rigdon was a minister. He would have been familiar with various biblical commentaries. So, but yeah, I think like Kent in this article shows that there's no direct barring from Adam Clarke, and especially so when it comes to his most recent article in response to Colby on the Isaiah text of the Book of Mormon, which was one of the worst pieces of so-called scholarship on the Book of Mormon that's ever been published.
Admittedly, I was really disappointed by that article. So juxtapose what I said about Colby's work about Enoch, right? Because I remember reading that at least thinking, oh, maybe this source was a little bit more research. Like I was intrigued by some of his work. Okay, maybe I can come back and revisit it somewhat later. And then, oh, he has another article. Let me read this about the Book of Mormon. Wait, really? You're saying that like these like one word differences are evidence of the idea he has the Adam Clarke commentary sitting on his lap as he's translating? Like I remember feeling really disappointed by the article when comparing it to the previous one. And Kent B. Jackson really hammers that down, where it seems like the unfortunate reality with this one is that it just seems like he had a conclusion and he was finding stuff to support it.
Yeah, and that's a problem when it comes to, say, Colby. He engages in parallelomania. His analysis is always flat at the best of times.
Now it's a good reminder for all of us. Like I know Latter-day Saint scholars and apologists, we can sometimes engage in parallelomania. We want to avoid that. But at the same time, if we're going to be consistent, then trying to tie this sort of thing together, just read Jackson's articles. Like really just do it. Like he does a really good job about trying to be fair while also being objective and talking about how these texts don't necessarily line up or say the things that we expect them to say, or how Joseph is directly ignoring what Adam Clarke is telling him to do. So,
and just on the JST, Kent, before he read the work on this from Wayman, he was actually open to it. I mean, if it could be proven Adam Clarke did influence directly the JST, that would be no skin off my nose and no skin off Kent Jackson's nose. In fact, he assumed that was the case before he read the scholarship, and it appears in one of the Pearl Grade Price encyclopedias that was published by Deseret. So it's not like a case like, say, LDS are allergic to this idea or it's anathema. It's just the examples provided by Wayman and Lemon were not that good. Except maybe like, say, one or two ones that depend on the Hebrew transliteration. But even then, you don't need Adam Clarke for that.
True. And then I think you also made a reference to like Sidney Rigdon being over the shoulder, and maybe he was familiar with some of this idea. So maybe we have like a secondhand communication there.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, and I say at best that would be the case. And that would be interesting, like, say, to follow up on in terms of a scholarly article. What did Sidney know when he met Joseph Smith?
So I know I'm feeling a little rushed here. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cause too much of a problem. But one of the things that as we kind of conclude here, as we're looking at the texts more closely that are propagated by critics as a means to the end of proving that Joseph is exclusively borrowing from his culture milieu in order to create the Book of Mormon, we run into a problem when we find that Joseph is not interacting with them in ways we would expect a competent forger to interact with them. And then also finding quite a few discrepancies between those texts and finding just really like tenuous connections with them. So either they're directly being contradicted, or if there is a connection, it just seems like so weak. Like I have a really hard time, like, a valley in a river for a view of the Hebrews just doesn't do it for me. I still think that we have to acknowledge the idea of we still should be open to exploring the idea of where the Book of Mormon came from. I have my own thoughts about it. Okay, you don't have to agree with me. But I still think that that's a question that is absolutely worth exploring. And I think that the unfortunate reality is that a lot of the evidence provided by these critics in the form of these texts does not academically satisfy the criteria that would be provided, that I would need in order to be able to accept that this is where Joseph is getting his information from. That said, you and I can both agree, and at the end of the day, the Holy Ghost is the one who ultimately gives us the testimony of the Book of Mormon. And while I think a lot of this stuff can be interesting, ultimately we have to acknowledge the fact that when we're talking about these kinds of topics, I believe that you can. Burke might not, you can get information from the Holy Ghost. I know Burke doesn't, and that could very well be what's driving a lot of these different critiques. At the end of the day, though, I wouldn't need to be Latter-day Saint to affirm that a lot of these connections really are just tenuous at best, and if not being overly misrepresented by Burke, because there are a couple of instances wherein he will cite a Latter-day Saint apologist or like make a reference to a Latter-day Saint apologist and imply or say that they've claimed something when they didn't, to make it look like the claims of apologists are much weaker than they actually are. So take that for what you will. That's about it.
Well, thanks for taking the time to do this. Hopefully it will be a very good resource, because this is like a common criticism against the Book of Mormon, like it is pilfered from various 19th century sources. And I know you're in a rush, but like for those who may want to get into contact with you, what's the best way to do it? And also
sure.
any websites or any organizations you want to plug before you leave.
Okay, so, well, there's no shortage of people who I like and like promoting their stuff. You're on that list. So, one of the things I of course will plug FAIR LDS does a really good job about providing brief summaries for a lot of these different issues. Lots of the know whys on Scripture Central are pretty good. Mormoner also provides quite a few primary sources that I appeal to often. And I will also say that if you want to contact me specifically, you can reach out to me at zwright@fairlatterdaysaints.org. That's my fair email. I'll likely respond to you. I will likely respond faster if you reach out to me on Facebook. So if you'd like a more quick response, that might work out better for you. But yeah.
Cool. And when you send me the slides, I'll put them on Dropbox and I'll include on the show notes. So
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
well, thanks again for coming on, and hopefully we can have you on again in the near future. If there's any other thing you want to critique and offer rebuttal to, we can definitely do that.
Well, of course, I'm always happy to come on. It's actually interesting. I was talking with somebody. I cited some of your work, and as you can imagine, people have some mixed feelings about you. But honestly,
my work and my personality.
Well, here's the deal, Robert. It's one of those things where I don't see. I love your research. I don't fully. Well, it's one of those things where I love what you do, and I appreciate how you try and conduct yourself in an academic setting and really try to make sure that your stuff is up to snuff. Admittedly, you and I come from different cultures. There's that. And I've been actually hold on. I've recently been told I need to tell you to repent for being mean. So there's that. I might as well get that out of the way here. Oh, okay. Maybe that wasn't entirely fair. I don't want to like make it sound like I'm being mean, but I do feel like a lot of people try and clown on you, and I don't think it's justified. I think you're a good guy. I really do. And in spite
I'm
of
now curious as to who asked me to repent, but you know,
I'll tell you later. But the long and the short of it is that I appreciate the work that you do. And I've appreciated your friendship, and I've appreciated our opportunities to collaborate. None of us are perfect, but we do what we can, and we want to be able to help people, and that's what I care about.
and my excuse is I'm Irish, so what do you expect?
And on that note,
Well, I know you have to head, so thanks for coming on, and we'll definitely do something again in the near future. So
I would love that. Let's do it. And if there's a live stream that you just need a buddy, hit me up. I'm usually available. But
that's
take it
great.
easy, all right, Robert?
You too. Bye.
Don't get canceled. Bye.